Welcome everyone to the lecture Engineering Equitable Resilience in Metro Manila, Possibilities for Urban Transformation in Muntinlupa City of the SICAR PH and NRC lecture series. This event is co-organized by the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines Investing in Climate and Disaster Resilience Project of the Ateneo de Manila University and the National Resilience Council. Our session today is broadcasted live on Facebook of the Facebook pages of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines and the National Resilience Council as seen on your screens. Please be guided by today's house rules. All attendees and participants are automatically muted upon entry. The ceremony will be recorded for documentation purposes. For our panelists, please keep your video off and your microphone muted, especially if it's not your turn to speak. For our attendees via Zoom, please send your questions through the Q&A option found at the bottom of your screens so our team can note this and raise them during our open forum. Likewise, for our attendees on Facebook, you can comment your questions so our team can collect this for the forum. Before we begin this webinar, we would like to announce to our panelists that we'll be having a group photo with all panelists after the opening remarks of Father Yap and Ambassador Romulo. Okay. We begin this webinar with opening remarks from the President of the Ateneo de Manila University, Father Roberto C, who's also the project holder of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines Investing in Climate and Disaster Resilience Project. Let us welcome Father Bobby Yap.
Ambassador Romulo, Mayor Fresnedi, our friends from Muntinlupa, and other government units, members of the academe, the private sector, honored guests, good morning. On behalf of Ateneo de Manila University, I am very pleased to welcome you to the Engineering Equitable Resilience in Metro Manila, Possibilities for Urban Transformation in Muntinlupa City, organized by the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines project and the National Resilience Council. Equitable resilience advocates the adoption of a systems lens in designing urban environments. By intersecting the physical and social geographies of a city at risk to the impacts of climate change and other hazards, resilient urban design enables the transformation from vulnerability to resilience through a combination of engineering, ecological, economic, and human development interventions. We are very pleased to have two experts to share insights on equitable resilience. Professor Stephen Gray from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and Professor Anne Ocampo from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And to show the relevance and applicability of these insights, we will feature responses from the Muntinlupa City Local Government Unit, the academe, and the private sector. Clear thinking about equitable resilience can benefit from framing it in terms of the models and analytical arguments of urban design, engineering, environmental sciences, economics, sociology, political science, and other disciplines. However, building the political and social will to implement equitable resilience will require an appeal to moral values, ethics, and to the sacredness of creation, our common home. We need to transform our institutions and systems, particularly our cultural and education systems, to enable the changes necessary for equitable resilience and sustain them for future generations. In his landmark encyclical Laudato Si, Pope Francis asserts that environmental education must not only provide scientific information, consciousness raising, and the prevention of environmental risks, it must also provide a critique of individualism, unbridled consumerism, and the myth of unlimited progress. Moreover, environmental education must seek to restore the various levels of ecological equilibrium, establishing harmony within ourselves, with others, with nature and other living creatures, and with God. We need educators capable of developing an ethics of ecology and helping people through effective pedagogy to grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care, especially for the poor. Effective environmental education should also lead our students to make an ecological commitment manifested by the noble duty to care for creation through daily actions, good habits, and changes in lifestyle. With an optimistic hope that we can provide and promote equitable resilience motivated by responsible simplicity of life, in grateful contemplation of God's world, and in concern for the needs of the poor and the protection of the environment, I thank you for participating in this conference on engineering equitable resilience, and I wish you all productive and insightful discussions. Please enjoy a good conference. Good morning to all.
Thank you, Father Bob. Now we call the chairman of the Carlos P. Romulo Foundation and the convener of the National Resilience Council, Ambassador Roberto R. Romulo.
Thank you very much, Ina. You know, I think in many ways, the introduction of Father Yap says it all. And I have to confess that I find it a formidable task to sort through the very dense and scholarly background paper that Antonia Yulo Loyzaga gave me. And with Father Yap ahead of me, I find it rather problematic. But I'm sure this subject is perfectly understandable to most of you. But I think there's a fair number of us who are a bit challenged. So my contribution this morning, as a way of welcoming everyone to this event, is to try to frame in my simplistic way what is the purpose of this endeavor. If I miss the mark, I welcome being corrected for the sake of everybody's clarity. At the end of the day, this is a very complicated issue. Let me start with the facts. Why Muntinlupa? Most of us associate coast with sea, and we think of storm surges or tsunami or even rising sea level, except for the third event, which is indeed inexorable. Such catastrophe can only occur every so often. But Muntinlupa is a coastal city by virtue being beside the country's biggest, many rivers and floodways empty into, and is prone to flooding that occurs readily and frequently and take a long time to receive. The urban poor are the most vulnerable. ISF, or informal settler families, comprise of 23% of the urban population in Metro Manila, and they live in inferior dwellings in danger zones, like on top and along waterways that suffer from flooding due to annual typhoons and monsoon rain. There are two reasons. First, this is where livelihood is. And secondly, this is all they could afford to dwell in. So for them, flooding is indeed an inconvenience, a nuisance that they are willing to live with. Unenforced and uncontrolled zoning, development patterns, and uncoordinated public agencies and decision making has built layers upon layers of urban sprawl and structure that do not accommodate inclusion and resilience. And with the consequences of climate change increasing in frequency and magnitude, coupled with rising urban population, the problem will magnify unless they are addressed. Here are how these are currently being addressed. Off-city resettlement does not work. It has taken ISFs away from their livelihood, income, services, and social networks. Many of them eventually return to the city. Second, in-city resettlement, on the other hand, while it addresses the off-city issues, face huge resource challenges, the availability of land, the cost of building dwellings, and providing support to infrastructure, both hard and soft. And to that, affordability issues. The innovative solution that will be the subject of our discussions this morning, one developed and articulated by the leading lights in the field, Professor Stephen Gray and Professor Mary Anne Ocampo, and their collaborators, calls for integrating the elements of urban design with resiliency and inclusion to respond to the resource constraints of in-city resettlement. In other words, designing cities and communities to be disaster resilient, but more important, integrates low-income urban dwellers into socio-economic mainstream, the urban landscape, thus improving not only their quality of life, but also the rest of the urban population. Allow me to cite the following challenges from my own perspective. One, public, private, and nonprofit sector collaboration is key to adopting and implementing this innovative solution. This will require massive investment. The challenge is, how do we get them to buy in, given the constraints in their coffers that the pandemic has caused? Second, implementation will always require a comprehensive policy framework that all stakeholders follow to avoid inconsistencies or redundancy. Elements might include land use, financing, affordability, as well as incentivizing the private sector. And how will it be initiated at the national level? Do we have the institutional capacity to implement this? Local government units also need to play a bigger role. Citizens must be fully involved. In the case of Muntinlupa, Laguna Lake and Basin requires national, regional, and local government working effectively together. So the solution at the end of the day has to go beyond the city of Muntinlupa. And finally, this is probably more for Mayor Fresnedi to respond. A well-planned urban development fosters inclusive growth and is resilient to natural disasters will not happen overnight, but will have a long gestation period. However, regrettably, our political system is not conducive to long-term planning. So that is the challenge. How do we overcome that? Ladies and gentlemen, with these thoughts, I thank you for your participation. And I wish everyone a fruitful, productive discussion. Thank you very much, Ina.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Romulo. Now we proceed to the group photo with all our panelists in the room. We'll also invite to the panel of reactors to turn on their videos, and we promoted special guests, Mr. Dito Borromeo and Sir Congressman Ruffy Biazon. So please also join us in this group photo.
Have Mayor Fresnedi.
Yes. Okay.
It's Mayor Fresnedi, yeah.
All right.
Mayor Fresnedi and the reactors, Father Jet, Architect Paulo Alcazaren.
Mayor Fresnedi is there and Congressman
yes.
Biazon.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's
Good morning,
everyone.
Mayor.
I'm
Morning,
present. Yeah.
Mayor.
Good morning. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning,
Okay.
ma'am.
Okay,
So,
so smiles for everyone. 1, 2, 3, smile. Thank you.
where is Congressman Biazon? Cannot
One
find him.
more photo. 1,
Okay.
2, 3, smile. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you,
all
ma'am.
look
Thank you, ma'am.
handsome and beautiful.
I agree.
Okay.
Okay, so we proceed back to our program. I'd like to introduce to you our webinar convener, starting from Ms. Antonia Yulo Loyzaga, the President of the National Resilience Council. Ms. Tony is also the co-principal investigator of the coastal cities at risk in the Philippines and member of the Board of Trustees of the Manila Observatory. So without further ado, I welcome Ms. Antonia Loyzaga.
Thank you, Ina. And thank you, Father Bobby and Ambassador Romulo for your insights. I think that these are a fitting statement of our condition. And in fact, the reason why we are introducing this new element of equitable resilience into the discourse on urban transformation, particularly in Muntinlupa City. Before I proceed, I'd like to be able to acknowledge some of our special guests who have come on board, apart from Congressman Biazon and Mayor Fresnedi and his very active team and our reactors. I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Dito Borromeo. Some of you may know the Philippine Transmarine Corporation under Dito's helm has really been behind the urban studio that occurred and was held in 2015 on Muntinlupa. Thank you very much, Dito, for joining us today. Dr. Gisela Concepcion. Giselle is the president of the Philippine American Academy of Scientists and Engineers. And Giselle and the National Resilience Council, myself, have been talking about how we may be able to, in fact, work more with the PAASE, as well as Dr. Dairit, who's a faculty member, of course, and board member of the Ateneo, but also the National Academy of Science and Technology. So thank you very much for joining us today. If I may just give a very brief background on why we thought that this would be a timely intervention in terms of our resilience discussions here in the country. Maybe we have the next slide, please. Lawrence, yes, thank you. The National Resilience Council actually has adopted this framework, and the framework initially had one pillar less, but you see that pillar today, which is the human security pillar. So we work within the context of this framework, leadership and governance being the most important in terms of resilience. And our definition of resilience really comes from the idea that we have pre-existing vulnerabilities and exposures in the country, and therefore bouncing back is not enough. We do need to bounce forward, and that implies transformation needs to happen in order for the risk trajectory to actually shift. While hazards are changing, and some of these we are familiar with in our past history, we really know that vulnerability and exposure is also changing, and therefore we are caught in this complex and dynamic risk environment, and cities in particular, because of their density of population resources, are really at the forefront of risk generation. So when we look at risk in cities, we're looking at how cities can bounce forward. And as Stephen has mentioned in an earlier discussion, It's not just about bouncing forward, it's about bouncing forward together. And that means inclusivity needs to be part, and equity needs to be part of that agenda. We have, apart from leadership and governance, these five pillars: human development, local economy, infrastructure, environment, and human security. In some of our cities, this has become one of the very, very peculiar situations and priorities in terms of human security. We're looking today at the built environment. And while we're looking at the built environment, we need to understand that this is inextricably linked to the rest of the pillars. And that leadership and governance are what are going to produce the kind of impacts that we desire. A resilient local government system, able to bounce forward rather than just bounce back. And of course, the reduction of deaths, damage, infrastructure and agriculture, etc. And what we're looking at is development continuity, and that's where our discussion is really grounded. Next slide, please. As Ambassador Romulo has stated, the problem with Muntinlupa is not just a problem of the city. It is a regional problem and it is a national problem. Moreover, it is not a humanitarian problem simply. It is a development problem. Trajectories of development have created this risk. And so we're looking at the Muntinlupa example as really illustrative of the intersection between the physical and social geographies that are now creating the risk. What you see there, the physical geography and its tendency or its potential for flooding at 2 meters sea level rise is indicated in the larger image. And as you can see, Muntinlupa lies really along the coastline of Laguna de Bay, which is in fact impacted from ridge to reef by the Marikina watershed, Marikina and Pasig rivers. And I apologize for the missing arrows there, but you get the message. And siltation from the Marikina watershed, because of its neglect, has actually caused the water levels in Laguna de Bay to rise. And this is where the complication from Muntinlupa, in fact, actually also has occurred. But we see that these are all interconnected in terms of the way the physical geography is, the elevation, the topography, etc. However, in the right side, and this has been updated, and you'll see an updated image with Doc Emma later on, you see the red and orange images and the spots there, which indicate the large informal settlements and their physical characteristics as seen by optical imagery and the algorithms that the observatory has developed. And this is where, in fact, the physical and the social have collided. So national policy, regional policy, and largely unregulated development, partly, of course, driven by commercial interests, have generated the situation of risk that the informal settlement families in the city of Muntinlupa are actually experiencing. So as Ambassador has said, this is a complex problem, goes beyond the city. However, there are interventions possible that can, in fact, alleviate some of the inequity in terms of access to the kind of housing, social services, education, and health services that may be offered by the city and its stakeholders. Next slide, please. So the National Resilience Council is running a resilient local government systems program, and Muntinlupa is one of our partners in collaboration with the Coastal Cities at Risk project. We have 3 phases in this program. We're now in the ADAPT year, and we thought it fitting to actually begin the ADAPT year discourse on deepening systems thinking with this particular event. As you can see, our questions progress from year 1, prepare, to just minimizing and baselining risk. Year 2, adapting, using existing systems to actually address the risk that we continue to discover. And finally, year 3, transformative year, which is in fact changing the systems, in fact, so we can bounce forward together. We are in a situation where we live with risk. The National Resilience Council is not a relief organization. We are in the risk prevention business. And in fact, together with our academic partners and local government unit partners, private sector stakeholders, and our partners in the CSO community, we would like to progress towards risk prevention while we live with uncertainty, both from climate and other hazards, but also from the current biological hazard, which is the pandemic. So on that note, I thank you all for coming today, and I thank Dr. Emma Porio and her team, the Coastal Cities at Risk team, which has led the transdisciplinary effort in research and action research initiative in the Ateneo with great response from partners. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Ms. Tony, for your introductory message. I now call next the co-convener of this lecture, Dr. Emma Porio, who is the project leader and principal investigator of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines and the professor of sociology at Ateneo de Manila University. She is also a science research fellow of the Manila Observatory. I now hand over to Dr. Emma Porio.
Good morning and welcome to the first lecture of the Coastal Cities at Risk and National Resilience Council lecture series for 2021 entitled Engineering Equitable Resilience in Metro Manila. Now I would like to acknowledge the kindness and generosity of everyone that made this webinar possible. One, I would like to acknowledge our distinguished keynote speakers, Professor Stephen Gray of the Harvard University School of Design, and Mary Anne Ocampo of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. To our distinguished panel of reactors, I would like to thank Mayor Fresnedi, Paulo Alcazaren, Father Jet Villarin, and Congressman Ruffy Biazon. To our Ateneo President and project holder of the Coastal Cities at Risk, Father Roberto R, thank you very much for your excellent and inspiring introductory message. And thank you always, Father, for your support of our endeavor. To Ambassador Romulo, Antonia Yulo Loyzaga, and the whole NRC team, thank you very much for your trust, for your support, and partnering with us. To Mayor Fresnedi and Muntinlupa City team, the CPDO office of Alvin Biron, the RRM office of Erwin Alfonso, and to Pilmon President Ellen Fresnedi, thank you very much for partnering with us in validating the National Resilience Council Barangay Scorecards through the Hazard Hunter and the Participatory Community Risk Assessment with the Pilmon and STP program, the RRMO and the CPDO, and the Barangay Councils. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, USIC Solidum, for your Hazard Hunter. Now let me go to our study on Metro Manila's socioeconomic profile and the implications for equity, risk governance, and resilience. As you can see here in this map, you'll see the three major flood basins of Metro Manila, the Camanava area or the Caloocan, Malabon, Navotas, Valenzuela flood zone, the Pasig, Marikina with Mangahan flood zone. As you can see here, the flood zones are in red and yellow areas. I always tell my students, we in Metro Manila, we live like Sisyphus. The rock falls down and we push up after the floods. And every year it's almost like that. You can also see here the yellow dots representing the 18 urban poor communities that we surveyed in 2008, in 2009, and in 2014 and in 2018. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge the generosity of the climate scientists at Manila Observatory, Dr. Gemma Narisma and Dr. Faye Cruz, for helping me construct this map and especially for locating the 18 poor urban communities in the respective flood zones. What have I learned in working with climate scientists at the Manila Observatory and at the Antonia de Manila University? As a social scientist, I've learned that the 20 typhoons and storms that visit us every year takes a heavy toll on the urban poor that lives in these areas and also the services that are provided by these areas. Ina, please, next slide, please. Yeah. Number two, I have also learned that these typhoons and tropical storms increase the exposure and vulnerability of the already vulnerable urban poor residing in these areas. It also, number three, it also decreases their capacity to cope with the damage caused by the climate impacts on their lives and their livelihoods. It also, I also have learned that it decreased the capacity to recover from these damages, especially the female-headed households. Thus, the cycle that gets repeated every year of damages and losses after every flood, you can almost understand what feminization of poverty mean, and also you can also see the workings of the intergenerational reproduction of the cycle of poverty in these areas. Next slide, please, Anna. Yeah, I'd like to thank Celine and Liz and Emil for this map of what I call the shifting patterns of informality and vulnerability in Metro Manila. These are the maps from 1997, 2000, 2010, and 2018, locating the informal settlements and mixed settlements in Metro Manila. As you can see, the city has become from green now to the last, the red areas that are really showing that the informal settlements and mixed settlements have become sort of integrated very much into the urban landscape. So what I'd like to say in the here is that the last lesson I've also learned when looking at this is that our patterns of growth and investment and development have increased our exposure and vulnerability to flooding and disaster risks. Given this, what we really need, can you please go to the next slide, please? The last lesson I have learned is that our patterns of growth, investment, and development in Metro Manila have increased our exposure and vulnerability to planning and disaster risk. Next slide, please, Ina. Given these challenges, we really need a multi-scalar approach to risk governance and resilience. Next slide, please, Ina. So, in closing, let me introduce our distinguished panel of speakers, Seven Gray and Mary Anne Ocampo, for sharing their very important work in Muntinlupa, and hopefully that we can learn to be more problem-focused, solutions-driven with the systems lens in the way we address the problems of prosperity and inequality in Metro Manila. Next slide, please, Ina. The last lesson I have learned is that our patterns of growth and investment and development in Metro Manila have increased our exposure and vulnerability to flooding and disaster risks. Next slide, please. Given these challenges in the metropolis, we really need an integrated, multi-scalar approach to risk governance and resilience in Metro Manila. There is a need to establish a coherence in the introduction of structural and non-structural measures of adaptation within and between sectors across time and space. Resilience frameworks need to be designed to address dynamic interactions between sectors and scales and along different decision-making levels. And Gender, generation, and social geographies need to be contextualized to reflect conditions in formal and informal sectors. In closing, let me now thank Professor Stephen Gray and Mary Anne Ocampo for sharing with us today their very important work, and I hope that we learn to be problem-focused and solutions-driven with a systems lens in the way we address the problems of prosperity and inequality in Metro Manila. Let me now introduce to you our distinguished speakers. Professor Stephen Gray is Associate Professor of Harvard Graduate School of Design and founder of Grayscale Collaborative. Professor Mary Anne Ocampo is Lecturer of Urban Design, Department of Urban Studies and Planning, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Principal of Sasaki. Thank you very much, Stephen Gray and Mary Anne Ocampo. It's your floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Porio. Marianne, are you there too?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So hello, and thank you for inviting us to participate in discussing this really important topic, building resilient cities. My name is Mary Anne Ocampo, and I am an urban design principal at Sasaki, which is an interdisciplinary international planning and design firm based in Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm a teacher at MIT, where I teach in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning.
And I'm Stephen Gray. I'm on the faculty at Harvard Graduate School of Design and principal of Grayscale Collaborative, which is an urban design and planning firm, also Boston-based. So thank you for having us. And I thought we would bring a little bit of snow to cool down the hot Filipino mornings or afternoons. But in all seriousness, we're really honored to be here and to share this research and to continue the conversation. So thank you.
So our presentation is entitled People, Environment, and Development, an Integrated Approach to Resilience in Muntinlupa City. Now more than ever, we are part of a global pandemic that is making visible the inequities and social services that we are seeing in cities today. We are also part of a climate crisis that is exacerbating these negative impacts on communities. Today, we'll share our work that is built on a design approach that is centered on people. We believe in connecting sectors and systems and finding solutions and shared knowledge at these intersections so that cities are more resilient and are able to bounce forward after disasters. We'll be discussing our process for this research effort and cross-sectoral collaboration, our approach to urban resilience through urban design, and ideas integrating systems to reimagine urban transformations for Muntinlupa City. This research began with Typhoon Haiyan, or also known as Yolanda, in the Philippines in 2013, and MIT's proactive call for fieldwork and research that would try to support the Philippines in the aftermath of the typhoon. Now, as a Filipina American, I traveled to Metro Manila to visit my family right after the typhoon, but also to do some field work. Now, Typhoon Yolanda became the strongest tropical storm ever recorded at landfall, killing and displacing thousands. Although Typhoon Yolanda did not center on Metro Manila, an average of 11 to 20% of typhoons and tropical storms pass directly over the capital annually, amplifying an already growing focus on disaster preparedness. An average of 20 typhoons touch down in the Philippines each year, with 50% of the worst typhoons and tropical storms in the country's history occurring since 2000. These storms pose especially high risk to informal urban dwellers living within the boundaries of the metropolis along waterways and shorelines. How can the Philippines become more resilient to typhoons, tropical storms, earthquakes, and other natural hazards? And how can communities, particularly the urban poor, be protected? The Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT sponsored a studio dedicated to studying Muntinlupa City. We worked with the World Bank at on their citywide development approach to informal settlement upgrading, with our class collaborating with the University of the Philippines, the departments in architecture and planning, Ateneo de Manila University, the Manila Observatory, NGOs, POs, city officials, barangay captains, and residents of Muntinlupa City. This research was sponsored by the Philippine Transmarine Carriers and ACM Landholdings, who had great interest in contributing to their community. Our process focused on partnerships and coordinating across sectors and disciplines to really find ways to leverage expertise and advance a shared interest in building resilient cities. Cities are only resilient as their most vulnerable citizens. Again, cities are only as resilient as their most vulnerable citizens. In Metro Manila, the most vulnerable citizens are the urban poor, who occupy the social and spatial edges of society between development and infrastructure, or along rail lines, riverbeds, easements, or flood zones. Our process of the citywide development approach to informal settlement upgrading centers on community engagement. Understanding needs, especially for those most affected, is essential to the work. In our field work, we hosted a town hall meeting, community meetings, and stakeholder interviews for the 2.5 weeks that we were in Metro Manila. We were finding ways that we could actually speak with the community members on the ground. The findings revealed that while many informal settler families were affected by regular flooding and issues of housing insecurity, however, these were not necessarily the deciding factors when determining where to live. The interviews revealed that people consistently ranked their first priority as the importance of living in proximity to resources, jobs, schools, sources of food and transportation, and proximity to their family and friends. The second priority was housing stability and land tenure. And third priority was really dealing with flooding. It was lower on the list than we initially thought when we arrived in Metro Manila and Muntinlupa. And to us, it was described as more of a nuisance than a major risk. Now, in Dr. Emma Porio's 2014 research entitled Climate Change Vulnerability and Adaptation in Metro Manila, she noted that although informal settlers recognize the risk of floods to their homes and communities, a majority of respondents were more concerned with economic problems related to unemployment and a loss of income. We also found through our interviews in Metro Manila and Muntinlupa the tremendous resilience of the women living within the barangays we visited. Women especially were highly impacted by the issues of housing insecurity and flooding.
So focusing on the social, ecological, and physical environments of Muntinlupa City, our process really began by meeting with the impacted community members in 4 barangays in Muntinlupa City, as well as conducting some analysis of the fragmented and disconnected systems which were impacting them the most. And we looked at this through 3 lenses: people, environment, and development. And for people, we're really talking about economics, both sort of macroeconomics, but also home economics, politics, and culture. The environment refers to both ecology, so natural systems, but also the publicness of space. And development is really looking at the formal and informal patterns of development. And as our process unfolded, we really began to need to define this integrated approach, which we came to call a socio-ecological urban design approach to resilience. So socio for the people, eco for environment, and the urban design really thinking about the development, all contributing to a resilient outcome. And so the definition that we've sort of been operating on in this work is the ability for overlapping networks, systems, and communities to anticipate and absorb disturbances and then bounce forward, transforming together, key, to become more socially, ecologically, and spatially equitable. So the following slides will give you a kind of a snapshot of our analysis in 3 scales. So each of them show the barangay scale, the municipality, and then the region. So for the human resilience perspective, we really saw a lack of infrastructure in many places. And these were really also the places where informal residents had settled along waterways and fault lines. And you can see in the middle image, the orange or the yellow tones are the clusters of informality, the red lines are the fault lines, and then the blue are the esteros, and the flood line are along Laguna de Bay. And in order to address this, the public sector has really mostly enacted out-of-city resettlement strategies. And these have really largely failed the people that they've aimed to serve. Because by moving families out of harm's way, they were also moved outside of the city limits to be closer to more affordable and safer housing options, but that moved them away from their points of employment and their social networks. So here the barriers to resilience really were a lack of basic household utilities and amenities, insufficient public resources to address informality, a continuous influx of rural migrants into city areas, and a failed relocation strategy that really mostly disconnected families from their social and economic resources. So you might ask yourself, why would people move into these precarious situations in the first place? And we did ask that. And the interviews revealed that many informal dwellers rely on the proximity to those resources, to their economic opportunities that brought them there from the provincial countryside, and their local communities for their livelihoods, which really makes out-of-city relocation programs really largely unsuccessful. And this was substantiated by Pope Francis during his 2015 visit, where he said, quote, "The pressures on family life today are many. Here in the Philippines, countless families are still suffering from the effects of natural disasters. The economic situation has caused families to be separated by migration and the search for employment, and financial problems strain many households," end quote. So we ultimately concluded that the best way to improve the lives of urban poor residents in Muntinlupa City would be to find ways to integrate informal and formal economies. Next slide. From an ecological resilience perspective, while access to the shoreline was really crucial for many fishing families along the shoreline of Laguna de Bay, it also exposed them to regular flooding. And it's also the most polluted part of the lake. You can see in the small diagram on the far right, the color coding of blue, red, yellow, and black. The black is the edge along Muntinlupa City, where it is below grade D level water, and it has killed off a majority of the populations and species of fish in the lake. Interviews with vulnerable populations living along the lakeshore revealed that regular and recurring flooding can take as long as 6 months to recede sometimes. But communities continue to live in areas surrounded by this polluted water from the industrial and garbage runoff upstream from the Marikina River due to their reliance on the lake for economic and for food even. It was clear that Laguna de Bay at the same time was an economic resource, a stormwater management challenge, and also a fragile ecosystem. Next slide. Lastly, for development, we looked at Metro Manila's history of urban growth. And we looked at this through various scales and forms of development among the various formal and informal patterns. There's a common misunderstanding, I think, that informal settlements are what cause or make flooding worse, when in fact it is private development that constricts the waterways and intensifies flooding. And in a similar way that the privatization and private development is constricting the waterways and causing some of these flooding issues, it's also causing some of your traffic congestion issues. If you look at the image on the far right, the red lines are the major roads that get you through Metro Manila, and the orange, the light orange areas are private roads. And so you end up with most of the ways to get through the city being privatized and sort of access only points. So decades of economic growth and expansion have included the expansion of informal economies and informal settlement patterns as well. And the result has been an urban environment which is both physically and socially disconnected, making it difficult for collective response to ecological hazards. Lakeshore communities also face the imminent threat of displacement from the construction of 7 landfill islands planned in order to finance the construction of the Laguna Lake Highway. So here the barriers to resilience are political, social, and spatial silos among communities, unenforced and uncontrolled zoning and development patterns, uncoordinated decision-making by public agencies across scales from the subnational to the municipal, and development that does not accommodate natural systems. For informal settler families, with often limited and agrarian skill sets. The barriers are the high cost of food, often greater than 60% of their household income, the lack of safe and affordable housing alternatives, and the threat of displacement. Next slide. So the socio-ecological urban design approach to a more resilient Muntinlupa includes three primary principles. Support a shared economy with an understanding that the national GDP is significantly dependent on and tied up with the informal sector. Work with nature, not against it, by acknowledging that nature will have its way and building accordingly. And break down silos by diminishing unproductive distinctions between formal and informal. So the next few slides are snapshots of some of the research projects from the graduate students at MIT. The first is called Intelligent Infrastructure. The second is called Rethinking Waterways. The third, Environmental Zoning. And the fourth, Manila Exchange. Nearly 1/3 of Manila's population lives in informal settlements. Next slide. A figure that may be doubled by 2050. And according to the 2011 census, at least half of residents in Muntinlupa lack refrigerators, stoves, clean water, or basic household amenities. And the poorest 15% of residents also lack flushing toilets and adequate trash collection services. Yet from interviews, we learned that these neighborhoods were important locations because of their proximity to friends, family members, and economic opportunities. So rather than relocation, are there opportunities to embrace informality as a legitimate form of settlement and to better serve these residents where they are? This project proposed intelligent infrastructure, creating a civic spine as a multifunctional adaptive infrastructure, which could provide centralized utilities within existing informal communities. This shared infrastructure could provide basic services of power, plumbing, refrigeration, and community amenities that reduce vulnerability to flooding, enhance access, improve health and safety, reduce costs, and ultimately incorporate informal neighborhoods as integral parts of the city. Next slide. The second project focused on designing with nature and rethinking waterways. These 7 man-made islands, which are proposed along the shoreline of Muntinlupa City to finance the Lake Expressway. They will finance the Lake Expressway, but they also threaten to create a giant moat and disconnect fishing communities from their sources of income and food. So how can this expressway be designed to serve regional transportation and economic development needs, as well as those of residents and families? And how might the system also be designed to clean the heavily polluted water? By positioning the islands between existing stream outlets with controlled openings, the moat could instead become a regional scale stormwater retention and bioremediation area, providing flood protection, but also becoming a shared public space and resource for Muntinlupa. Next slide.
So the third project focused on innovative planning through environmental zoning. With a growing number of rural migrants moving to Muntinlupa each year, the city has opportunity to explore socio-ecological land use and development strategies. How can environmental zoning protect and preserve the natural environment while connecting rural migrants to urban employment opportunities? By building on the agricultural skills of migrants and taking advantage of wetter, cheaper land at the edges of the city, an environmental zoning and planned informality strategy could create dense development clusters surrounded by floodable farms and a system of environmental corridors that support ecological health. A shared economy approach developed around urban agriculture could divert rural urban migrants away from hazards and informal developments and towards new clusters of mixed-use, mixed-income housing surrounded by agricultural land. Development patterns could then respond equally to the flow of water and an increasing demand for the production of food. In this scenario, new developments and open systems perform dual roles as flood-reducing landscapes and social infrastructures, supporting both economic productivity and social development. The last MIT project is called Manila Exchange, distinctly Filipino. Now, this group sought to integrate formal and informal economies with a new urban vision. The project proposes a physical framework for the rapid expansion of Metro Manila, using the expressway or Laguna Lake Highway as an opportunity to reimagine how to design the new land reclamation islands. What new forms of inclusive housing, ecologically performative open space, and shared mobility options are possible with culturally rooted land making? The project analyzed the People's Park and Sukat to understand how the community space is a center of barangay activities. As once part of the rubble waste from the Southern Luzon Expressway, we heard the story of how it became a community park for all, not just a private development site. The barangays along the lakeshore were studied to understand how their spatial organization can inspire new development. New patterns for living with water in urban communities could be imagined through morphologies that are both more authentic to Filipino culture and more resilient to Filipino hazards. Development practices such as the palapal or rice paddy dike could inform contemporary construction techniques, a vernacular that could be more responsive to regular flooding. Civic projects such as the proposed landfill islands associated with the expressway present near-term opportunities to explore new spatial and infrastructural development paradigms. Now, this vision was to create a distinctly Filipino urbanism, and part of that was with new incentives for private development in city making that would really value the natural and environmental systems as well as the social systems, enforcement of existing regulations, and the design of new edge typologies that would really benefit the community as an integration of formal and informal. The private sector could establish productive relationships between water and land use, as well as between, again, the formal and informal. So last, we wanted to kind of zoom back out. We are also practitioners as well as academics, but we wanted to think about how does this apply to practice? How does this work? How can we take the lessons learned from this 4-month study at MIT with partnerships in academia and apply them to professional practice? And so for us, part of this was focusing on work south of Muntinlupa and thinking about the development patterns that were happening in Metro Manila. For us, one major question was how can the paradigm of current development shift from development, infrastructure, and industry eroding at the natural environment, eroding at agriculture? How can it be a new paradigm of city making that produced a new kind of balanced approach of healthy living, a new production model that would integrate development, infrastructure, environmental systems with social systems? For us, we've worked on projects where new townships were being formed and a whole new way of kind of creatively thinking about new strategies for how you would actually create parts of the city. We proposed south, again, of a project called Ananas, a closed loop system that leveraged some of the agricultural land as a site that would create jobs, that would reduce food costs, would improve access, improve food quality, and really be a destination for leisure and a way to think about financial sustainability for those who are developing as well as for those who are living there. 4 major principles began to be the kind of guiding forces for this particular project that exemplifies a way of working within the kind of 3 aspects of people, environment, and development. From creating a comfortable microclimate by maximizing wind capture, thinking about heat island effect, integrating food systems by introducing urban kind of agricultural strategies, and creating that sense of place, and then creating a resilient community by incorporating those natural and social systems and designing with that in mind for future development. So in conclusion, this vision was to plan for people in a way that begins to integrate social, economic, and natural systems as part of an urban design approach and practice. So we had 4 questions that we would leave you with that we thought is part of this work. The first is really about how can urban development in Muntinlupa be more resilient, and for whom? Who is this for? How can we eliminate separations and distinctions between formal and informal communities? What are our roles as planners, designers, policymakers, academics, and developers in this process? And then last, how do we move from vulnerability to resilience by bouncing forward together? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mary Ann and Professor Stephen Gray, for the insightful lecture. I now welcome back Dr. Emma Porio to introduce our panel of reactors and moderate their portion for responses.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Mary Ann, for that brilliant but thought-provoking lecture presentation. We now call on the first panel that I will panelists that I will call on to respond will be Father Jet Villarin, the former project holder of the Coastal Cities at Risk, as well as the Vice President for the National Resilience Council's academic and scientific institutions. After that, I will Architect Paulo Alcazaren will follow, followed by Mayor Fresnedi, but I will call them. Father Jet, can you please?
Oh, thank you, Emma.
Okay.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. Well, I just have about 5 minutes
Yes.
to react, so I will try to be brief. First of all, thank you, Stephen and Mary Ann, for your study, for your extensive study. It has evoked so many things also inside me. First of all, let me just acknowledge that I appreciate your bringing together the social and the environmental, as we know that these are both interlocking concerns. The second is that I also noticed that some of the solutions, like these armatures, these extensions into the bay, they're not merely technocratic solutions, as you know, as we all acknowledge. Anyway, some ideas. First, about 5 on the formal and informal divide. I think what's crucial here is to acknowledge first that the informal is really characterized by instability. It's a very fluid situation for those who are in informality, and what will I've been asking myself, what will be the moonshot? What will make things more stable? And I think we all agree it will be there are a host of factors, but it can be jobs and shelter, housing, property, tenure, education, health. Education, health, a little bit long term, but if we wanted something more immediate, I think it's really the security, job security, and that has always been a problem, I think, for us. But what's crucial, I think, is this sense of ownership. And there can be financing mechanisms, lease-to-own arrangements for people to own property. I'm reminded, I'm not an economist, but I'm reminded of Hernando de Soto, that Peruvian economist. I read his book, The Mystery of Capital, a long time ago. But he was advocating for stable legal systems, property rights, against which people can leverage credit or even expand their little enterprises. The second point is about governance, and I'm glad that Mayor Fresnedi is here. As we all know, a good leader really makes a big difference. But as you know, in the Philippines, there are leaders and there are leaders. Even in one small municipality, you have all sorts of leaders. You have political, economic, and social leaders. And what we need is a leadership that can tame and mobilize these political, economic, and social forces that are at play. In Metro Manila, that's a different problem. You have to work with, there are 16 little kingdoms here in this region. So you have to work with these other local leaders, how to balance the common good at the national and local scales. Third, I think, if we were going to address the informal, formal divide, we will need to address the urban and rural divide. Many years ago, I was actually in Navotas, living among people there, and there's a place in Navotas. It's one of the densest places in the world, and it's named Little Samar. And my family comes from Samar, and I was asking the people there, how come you're here? I mean, Samar is beautiful, and there are a lot of resources in the rural, in the countryside. And the people there said, no, there are more opportunities in the city. Rural poverty is actually more oppressive, can be more oppressive than urban poverty. There's better education in the city, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to address, I think, also rural poverty. And I think this is also beyond Muntinlupa. Fourth, academe. Well, the role of academe, well, knowledge, perhaps from science, advocacy, communication, to educate. Now, if we can make people learn that trees equals regulated water supply, maybe we can also try to help people learn that rivers and esteros equal safe and clean water or flood control, etc. I noticed, for instance, that in one graph, the C6 road, a 50-year and 100-year flood line was marked, and I think that will change surely in a globally warmer world. The 100-year flood may no longer be just the same as the 100-year flood last year. Fifth and last, well, this is more than just, it is not, this is beyond Muntinlupa actually. I've been reflecting, and I think you've heard me on some occasions say this. The development in Metro Manila has been, I don't know, haphazard, and it's been, if you look at it historically, it's been we're just radiating outward. For a country of 108 million people, I think we need to develop another city. We only have nearly 3 major cities. Is that enough? 3 cities for a country of 108 million people. That's Manila, Cebu, Davao. I think, Muntinlupa means little land. And if you look at this thin strip of land between 2 major water bodies, we have to ask, what's the carrying capacity of that little piece of land? And it's not just Muntinlupa, it's actually the National Capital Region. Is this sustainable in the long term? This strategy of just incrementally radiating outward, expanding from a center and just going out radially. Perhaps it's time again this is a long-term thing, but to think of another city. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Jet. We now move on to the comments of architect Paulo Alcazaren. Architect Alcazaren, I think, is one of the prime architects who have been interrogating urbanism, development, and public-private spaces and the landscape of the city. Okay, Paulo, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Porio, and thank you to you and Tony for inviting me to this event. And it's very hard to follow Father Jet. In fact, he beat me to the etymology of Muntinlupa being small land and the issue of carrying capacities, which I was about to bring up. And he's covered a lot of ground that I wanted to point to, especially with the informality of Metro Manila. So in Metro Manila, I believe that even though it's a mix of formal and informal by definition, since we're all in this together, we are informal, and Metro Manila by definition is an informal metropolis. So it's a matter of context really. And sitting through the wonderful presentation of Stephen and Mary Ann made me look at these issues from two points of view, one as a former academic and urban historian, and another as a professional working in the field of urban design and landscape architecture. First, from a historical point of view, we've been trying to address the issues of metropolitan growth and formal and versus informality last years, since before the start of the Metro Manila Authority. And by coincidence, I'm working now with Dicky Angstadel, who was the technocrat in charge of that. And we share a lot of, we have a lot of discussions on this historical cycles of trying to address informality and the recurring themes of displacement and on-site housing crops up, and the issues of the lack of social or low available affordable housing seems to be one of the keys to moving forward or bouncing forward, as all of the speakers seem to be using that metaphor. And I just keep thinking of basketball. And if you're bouncing forward, the problem with Metro Manila, like Father Jet had mentioned, you're really playing in 17 basketball courts of different sizes with different teams. And it's difficult to balance all the bouncing unless we have a shared vision, which despite the League of Mayors or the Metro Manila Councils does not seem to be happening. And so from the point of view, again, of a former academic and as a student that went through university at College of Architecture in UP Diliman in the 70s, where we were taught the principles of design with nature under the McCarthy template, the socio-ecological urban design approach is today's take on what seems to be basic principles of sustainable, resilient design that we all understood before, but never have been able to implement, mainly because of the politics and the constructs, the governance construct of Metro Manila that still uses boundaries defined by realities of 300 years ago. So I believe that we have to reframe our approach to metropolitan design and planning for Metro Manila, as well as Metro Davao and Metro Cebu. We do have 145 cities, and that's the opportunity for growth. And from the point of view of a private practitioner with clients that are forming new townships, one wonders how to balance that approach of, do we just grow from this 145, or do we spread out? And I just stop myself for using the word sprawl, and establish new townships, when MacArthur would have said, no, it's not the best place. You should not really expand beyond your urban cores. But there is a balance that can be had, and it's very difficult to look at it both from the point of view of the site itself, as Stephen and Marianne have done with Muntinlupa, and the possibilities of turning that moat into something else, as well as the larger context of urban development in the whole of the Philippines. And so I end with just saying that, yes, it seems as what Dr. Porio had mentioned at the start of her little talk, everything is Sisyphean. And but the thing is, we're all Sisyphus. We're all in this. And I do hope that we don't go to another decade of recycling all of these concepts that we know work, and finally apply all of these principles we know to be good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Architect Alcazaren. Now we move on to the comment of Mayor Fresnedi. Mayor Fresnedi and the Muntinlupa City LGU has been awarded several times as the most competitive and business-friendly city. Mayor Fresnedi?
Good morning. Dr. Porio. Good morning, the esteemed panel presenters led by our National Resilience Council, coastal cities at risk in the Philippines, faculty members and researchers from the academe, my fellow public servants in the local and national government, guests from the private sector and non-government organizations. Again, good morning. On the papers Muntinlupa Matters, Addressing Informality in Metro Manila, and Resilient Edges by Professors Stephen Gray and Mary Anne Ocampo, they have provided options for applicable resettlement and upgrading strategies for our residents in the coastal barangays. We have learned that relocation is not the answer to informality due to many cited factors, but on-site shared infrastructure with basic services and vulnerability reducing strategies is a more favorable option. These studies debunk our usual notion of urban development, that is off-site relocation, and even economic development and unfacilitated social transformation. Formal and informal sector also need to be integrated to live in harmony with and not against each other, resilient people, environment, and development. The urban development principles presented as a result of an on-site study in our lecture barangays, in 4 barangays in the city of Muntinlupa, for the informations of the participants, we have only 9 barangays in Muntinlupa, and 8 barangays are adjacent to Laguna Lake. It remains all the more very relevant because these barangays remain vulnerable in disaster situations, and that displacement is imminent due to national government-led infrastructure projects. In coordination with the national government, they have presented numerous infrastructure development along the shoreline of Muntinlupa, Laguna Lake. So there is this new development in our city. Our city are now preparing in coordinations with the stakeholders, with the citizens of Muntinlupa, the community mostly affected, and most especially the national government, most especially the public works, on what would happen, what would be the effect of this development and these communities. On Dr. Emma Porio's paper on prosperity and inequality in Metro Manila, we have witnessed cases on social housing and local development exacerbated by weaknesses on disaster management and governance. While the Philippine economy rebounds stronger, despite the recent calamities, reducing poverty incidence and income inequality remain dismal. In the context of housing the poor, we must prioritize solutions that work for the majority of the population, especially the most vulnerable sector of the society. Although easier said than done, there has to be a balancing of competing interests, social housing for the poor versus capitalist initiative of the private developers. In the advent of the national government's Build program, the local government ensures that all stakeholders are involved in the discussion and all grievances are not just documented, but are heard and are taken care of. A lot of solutions have been made because of this public hearing conducted by the City Council to address some of the concern of those communities affected by this development. Social preparations and economic empowerment are at the core of our dialogues whenever discussions are being made on projects that are particularly shaping our urban landscape. The task ahead is daunting, and the local government unit cannot do it alone. And it goes beyond just looking at the geohazard maps and meeting with few stakeholders. And urban transformation is a challenge not just in Metro Manila, but in most cities in the country and the developing world. Add to this the challenges brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic that tested the promptness and resilience of many governments and economies. Most things were never the same. Nonetheless, as the local chief executive, I remain to believe it is a shared responsibility. Muntinlupa City is an institution with an open heart, open hands, and listening ears, conscientious planning, putting resources where it should be allocated, partnering with the stakeholders, the academe, and the national government. These are imperative towards continuous learning and success. I thank the National Resiliency Council for facilitating this lecture series, of which the City of Muntinlupa is featured for promising possibilities of urban transformation. Let us continue to work together, not just in the planning and conceptualization, but more importantly, in the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the proposal presented. Thank you, and stay safe, and may God bless us all. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Mayor Fresnedi, for that very thoughtful and very calibrated message on how we proceed. Before I turn on to the next speaker, I'd like to thank you, Mayor Fresnedi, for your support of our engagements with the National Resilience Council and with the local barangay councils and with your city planning office and with the RMO and with Pilmon, who has been very crucial in testing and validating the barangay resilience scorecards of the National Resilience Council. Thank you very much, Mayor Fresnedi. Can we now move on to the comments of Congressman Ruffy Biazon? Thank you very much for honoring our request, even though it's a last minute. So thank you very much. I understand you're also managing another meeting, so we really appreciate this, Congressman Biazon. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. How is my audio?
Very good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to give some comments, although it's just an impromptu participation. But I appreciate very much the presentation that was given to us by Stephen and Mary Ann. And actually, it gave a confirmation through a scientific and academic study of what we have been informally and anecdotally observing, that relocation programs of the national government fail because of the detachment of resettled families from the sources of their socioeconomic needs. We saw this in previous projects of the national government, and that is why when the relocation of informal settlers along the railroad tracks was started, the discussion was started way back in the early 2000s. We were pushing for the in-city relocation program as far as that particular project was concerned, because we saw that people who were relocated from NCR going out into the provinces eventually went back to settling informally to the NCR due to lack of opportunities and even services. So we do observe that, and I'm glad that there is scientific and academic basis for that, for our future planning. Second, the data on the water quality of the lake, especially in the Muntinlupa area, as included in the study, is also confirmation of what we believe is a step that for national government to take. And that is to improve the water quality of the lake as a source of domestic water needs. In fact, I filed a bill in the House of Representatives proposing to declare Laguna Lake, the entire Laguna Lake, as principally a source of domestic water use. Because you may know that in Muntinlupa, Maynilad has their water processing facilities for domestic use. And they often have challenges. Their processing plants have challenges because of the water, the quality of the raw water that they take in. In layman's terms, we can describe Laguna Lake as the septic tank of Metro Manila. And imagine that's where we get our domestic water. In discussions in Congress, it was admitted by the national government agencies that the category of Laguna Lake is lower than the category that would be needed if we were to make it as a principal source of our domestic water. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of policies among LGUs surrounding the lake and even national government, it does not, the policies do not have the same level that it should be if we were to take the lake as a source of our domestic use water. So I think one of the strategies that should be done is to do that recategorization of Laguna Lake so that everyone will be compelled to ensure that the quality of the water in the lake is held to a higher standard than what it is now. Another thought that we have in mind is why don't we make the lake not just a source of quality the quality domestic water, but also a source of economic prosperity for more people than it is catering to now. The way we see it, mainly, of course, the local fishermen, the local small fishermen around the lake, and the owners of the large-scale fish farms are the ones dominating the economic use of the lake. If we achieve making the lake a source of livelihood for more sectors, it would address the continually expanding ranks of informal settlers in the Metro Manila area surrounding the lake, who have marginal sources of livelihood and income right now. As we can see in other places, lake shores are sources of other kinds of income, ecotourism, commercial development. We believe that more people will be able to benefit economically from the lake if we pursue that. But that is just, of course, a theory of mine, but subject to further study. And final comment, the proposal to include rail, as I saw earlier in the presentation, or mass public transport in the Laguna Lakeshore Expressway is really a wonderful idea. When I was conducting social preparation meetings before with regard to the relocation of informal settlers along the railroad tracks, I was explaining to people that it shouldn't really matter if you're living in the rural areas of Laguna or farther south. If there was mass public transport that people can use to go into NCR where they work. I mean, we see this in other countries where workers in the city actually reside outside the city. But because of the availability of mass public transport, they can continue living and decongest the urban centers and still have their livelihood in the cities. So if incorporating a mass public transport through rail with the Laguna Lakeshore Expressway, I think it's one way to do that. Perhaps we can even consider if cost would be a concern there. Instead of having a Lakeshore Expressway, a toll road, which basically caters to private vehicles, why not just use it exclusively as a means, as a public transport, mass public transport by rail? Um, we already spent a lot of money in providing for private vehicle owners, connecting the north and the south. So we would just be replicating it along the Laguna Lakeshore. Again, just catering to private vehicle owners. Whereas we can take a look at mass public transport and uh, enable people to easily move in and out the Metro Manila area. Well, that would be the comments that I can share based on the presentation that was given, and we do appreciate these kinds of initiatives and studies, so that we can come up with policies or solutions to address the concerns that we have been discussing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman Ruffy, for these very exciting issues that you have raised and possibilities. So I hope you can stay for the Q&A later, because there's a big major question that we could benefit from your insight. So we now ask Professor Stephen and Professor Mary Ann to respond to these comments. We have 2.5 minutes each, total of 5 minutes. Thank you very much. So Stephen?
Okay, yes.
Or,
yeah, so thank you. I mean, this is, all of the thoughts and comments are really interesting, and I think really worth digging into. And I can only, since I have 2.5 minutes, I'm going to try to hit the things that I think I can talk to the best in that amount of time from each person. So I'll start with Father Villarin. So you talked about, the informality really being kind of about fluidity and instability, and how do you find a stable situation? How do you find a silver bullet, or a moonshot, as you called it? And you described, job security, housing tenure, governance that is broadly effective, mobilizing economic, social, and political vision. But you also talked about the relationship and of formal and informal divide to the rural and urban divide. And I think this is actually, we can look at some examples from the United States from history. And when we look at the migratory movement patterns of Black Americans in a post-slavery situation where they were living in southern rural situations, and eventually, when the sort of those rural laws, the Jim Crow laws, were killing people and really keeping them from economic opportunities, they started moving into cities and moving north, right? And so there was this rural to urban migration of Black Americans really at the turn of the 20th century, and in the middle of the 20th century, it peaked again. And what ended up happening is when Black migrants from the rural countryside in the United States moved into cities, they were pushed into the corners and into the edges and into the parts of the cities where the white dominant culture wasn't and didn't want to be. And in fact, when they came in too large of numbers, people that could afford to moved out into the suburbs, right? And so I think there's something to learn about, even from the United States, formal and informal, Black and white, it's kind of a similar kind of divide in terms of the social and physical and spatial divides in cities. And now, US cities really have a situation where they have large low-income urban populations, which are now being displaced again by the higher income people that want to live in those urban centers. And so we're facing the same challenges, and I don't know what the answer is yet, but maybe I can get to that when I get to Mayor Fresnedi's points, or even architect Alcazaren. So I'll go to architect Alcazaren next. And I just want to quickly thank you for some of the writings that you've done, actually looking at the histories of these political divides and these boundaries that you say have been 300 years old in the making. And in one of your pieces that we reference in our article, you talk about the law of the Indies and the sort of establishment of the intramuros and extramuros condition. Which really was, the intramuros was for the Spanish elite, and outside of the walls, the extramuros was for all of the Chinese and the Japanese and all of the sort of, you know, Eastern folks, Filipinos that were living in Metro Manila at the time. And so, you know, this kind of microcosmic moment, this historical moment, you know, you talked about it from the point of view of a historian and academic, really has exponentially expanded and extruded to the ways in which development continues to happen. There are these private gated communities for those who are the elite, and then there are the backs of the walls of those developments, the outside of the wall where people are living. And so I think looking to history and questioning that history and critiquing it, and then finding ways to move forward in a different way, I think is going to be key to everything that you do, to everything we do. That's the way that we need to be. If we don't look at our past, then we won't learn the lessons and we're bound to repeat them. Mayor Fresnedi, you talked about resettlement and integration strategies of formal and informal, bringing together the social environment and development, sort of referencing our writing. And you talked then about new development that's coming and that it's really been in conversation with some of the most affected citizens. And you said, you know, all stakeholders must be involved in the process. And so, you know, my question is, when you say all stakeholders must be involved, does this include the urban poor and the development community in the same conversation? Because if they're not in the same conversation, you have two separate conversations happening and they're not going to intersect. And the development that comes is not going to respond to or support the needs that are expressed in those engagements. And so really, it's going to come down to deeply participatory conversations, even to the point of participatory budgeting and decision making. And one of the things I'm really focused on in my work in the United States right now is working with institutions and organizations and municipalities to understand that once you get to the point where you're doing participatory planning and engagement, you've already made too many decisions about what's going to be funded and what's going to happen, that we're basically picking the colors of the chairs. Right? We're not really looking at whether that project is the right project for the people involved. So now to Congressman Biazon. I think that this idea of mass transportation and rethinking the C6 Dike Expressway as a public transportation corridor is brilliant. And I wish I thought of it myself. And I suggest you all explore that option because it really addresses all of the issues. It addresses the main reason why you're even building it, which is traffic congestion. And so if you just build another road, more people are going to be driving on more roads as opposed to reducing the number of people driving, reducing the number of cars. I also think the idea of reclassifying the national waters, reclassifying the lake as a national water source in order to sort of build a public will to clean it up is also very smart. It also would channel some funding in a different kind of way from different pots that are already earmarked. And the idea that there are too few sectors that dominate the capitalization of the lake, primarily these fish farms, and that you could expand that to ecotourism or other things by changing the quality of the lake, by changing the classification, which gets you more money, I also think is a very smart thing. And I hope that you pursue that in Congress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Mary Ann, it's your floor.
Great, thank you. I appreciate Stephen's very specific comments to each of the reactors, and I appreciate their comments. I'm going to zoom out and think about maybe more holistically with all the things that I've heard. I think that we're all aiming, and we've been talking about this kind of equitable resilience, equity-driven planning. What does that mean when you are working to create more resilience within your metropolitan area, within your country? And I feel like, you know, understanding the most negatively impacted, compounded issues in a way where you're understanding the populations are so very important. And so for me, it's understanding those disproportionate impacts on the different populations, the urban poor. But if you even dive deeper into that, I think that there's issues where we could look at gender, that we can understand it from a woman's perspective of living within a barangay that's often flooded and how she's a caregiver. And I think that there's so many elements to understanding the specificity of what people are going through. How does that impact larger systems thinking? And I believe that when we think about, as Stephen has mentioned, when we think about bouncing forward, there's this sense of space and going towards something, this momentum. There's a sense of time. And I do agree that we have to look to the past to understand those lessons, to understand the present, to project a future. And for the Philippines in particular, in my research, really understanding the kind of colonialism and the way in which that has impacted perhaps some remnants of that may be inherent in the way that we practice and the remnants of the built environment, whether they are walls that were to protect cities or walls that are protecting villages or neighborhoods today. How do we break down those walls so that there is this integration? What have we inherited from the past? What is the, post-colonial mentality, moving away from that and thinking about all the beautiful and intelligent assets and people that you have that are part of the Philippines that are immense resources. When Stephen and I talked about joining today, we're so mesmerized by Dr. Porio's work, by the work that we've heard today, and you all have done amazing job of talking through and educating folks and knowing what these issues are. And I think we, as people who are living in the US, who work at these other institutions, we are learning from you. And so I think, I applaud the heart and the intelligence and the resilience that we ourselves have seen from the Filipino people. And we think that it's going to be education, it's going to be integration, it's about coordination that's going to carry you forward into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Ann. These are really great thoughts in terms, thank you for bringing in gender, because it has been silent all this time. So thank you very much. I'm very grateful for that. We now move on to the question and answer portion. And there's a question here, or a comment from the DGIA, and addressed to all panelists and attendees, especially Mayor Fresnedi and Congressman Biazon. The comment says, there is a huge portion in Muntinlupa, about 450 hectares under the Department of Justice, that is still underdeveloped. How could NBP reservation be used for the benefit of the residents of Muntinlupa? Who will go first?
Okay. Well, this a big tract of land that you mentioned a while ago is owned by the national government. So any development plan that would take place, or any plan should be coming from or to be initiated by the national government. We are just waiting, although in our comprehensive development plan, we planned it as a land use PUD, no? So that we will be fitting in the plan of the national government. But then we always believe that any plan of the national government must be coordinated to the local government, because although this is not owned by the local government, we will be affected whatever development happens in this big tract of land. And actually, this is no longer that big area, because a huge portion of that area was already allocated to the relocatees coming from the Philippine National Railways track, here in Muntinlupa. they allocated 50 hectares for the relocations of those living in the from 8 barangays covered
Okay. Yeah.
by PNR.
Yeah.
And the 105 hectares was allocated for housing program of the national government. This is what we call the Katarungan Village 1 and Katarungan Village 2. So what was left is around 250 hectares. But then, unfortunately, every administration has its own development plan in this area, coming from President Cory, President Ramos, President uh, Estrada, President Pinoy, and now uh, President Duterte. We are just hearing that there is a plan of the national government for a long-term lease of this area for to be leased to and big developers. But until now, we were not formally informed of this plan of the national government. So this is the present status of that big tract of land.
Mayor Fresnedi, may I tell you that in our participatory community risk assessment that we did last year to the 9 barangays, their main concern really of the residents and the citizens of Muntinlupa is they were saying, we are here, but we cannot access this resource and we are treated far away. So I know that, you're dealing with the national government, but I would like to tell you that your citizens are really saying, what is our right to this nearby space? I mean, some people are even complaining they cannot have good access to internet because of the security issue. But basically what I'm saying is that your residents whom I've talked to, the citizens of Muntinlupa, are actually saying that their rights and claims to these resources locally. Thank you. But
Yes,
basically, can we go to Mayor, Congressman
can
Biazon, please?
can I reply on that remarks, Dr. Porio? That is the real situations that
Can
we
the
can
national government hear it? That the people on the ground?
Actually, there were times that the movement of the people in the city are being restricted because of the some regulations being adopted by the Bureau of Corrections in the area.
Yes.
Actually, any projects initiated by the local government, requested by the residents of the area, we need the approval of the Bureau of Corrections authorities for us to proceed with the projects. That is the reality of what is happening in this big tract of land in Muntinlupa.
But I hope upstairs will hear the cry of the people on the ground. Okay, Congressman Ruffy, can you please go ahead?
Yes, I would like to affirm what Mayor Fresnedi has said, that as far as the local government is concerned, we have been informed of different kinds of plans starting way back through all administrations. But so far, to my assessment, the most advanced plan would have been during the time of President Arroyo, when an actual master development plan was made. But it did not push through. Her term ended, and then the Aquino administration likewise did not put much attention to it. Up to now, this present administration has not put in the forefront the plan or the proposal to transfer the Bilibid prison outside Muntinlupa. In fact, I also filed a bill to institutionalize that plan. But even in the House of Representatives, it has not gotten much attention. I have raised it in every budget hearing of the Department of Justice, which has the jurisdiction over the property through the Bureau of Corrections. As of the last meetings that we had, it's not in the priority of activities that they would want to do. The Bucor Modernization Law has given the Bureau of Corrections absolute authority over the use of that property. So while it is within the bounds of Muntinlupa City, we Muntinlupeños do not have the power or the authority to just initiate it on our own. So we are trying to get the national government to accept those proposals to develop it.
Okay, thank you very much. There are two other pressing questions that was raised from the floor. A question from Ms. Tony. How does COVID-19 impact urban design and existing socio-ecological inequities? And the question from Jessica Bersilia, our co-principal investigator in CCRPH, she says, from the perspective of your expertise, what are the indicators of formality and informality most relevant to resilience building and sustainable development? Can we hear from the other panelists your response to this question? And Paulo?
May I say, may I request Paulo to also speak to that? Sorry.
Yes. Paulo.
Yes, like I said in my remarks, we're all informal. So the government is full of different definitions, and the definitions of what is informal or what is poor differs from NEDA to all of the individual LGUs to suit their own agendas. So I have no answer to how we can qualify or quantify that definition. But definitely, if you do not have access to good affordable housing, then you are left with no option but to take things into your own hands and build as 1/3 of the metropolis is done on your own.
But Paulo and Tony, isn't that we are trying to assert that in a new normal, we cannot continue with the old blueprint of state society engagement, but really we have to co-generate, we have to co-create the possible solutions. Can you comment on that, or at least can you comment on the other questions as well?
Tony?
Tony.
I can't comment on my own question. I have to say I asked that question.
I'm throwing the ball to you.
And I think that I really think that Paulo and Marianne and Stephen are the experts in the indicators of formality and informality, because these are, of course, very contextual, but there is a stream of foundational, I would say, indicators that can be identified. And so I leave that question to Paulo and Marianne and Stephen to answer. What indicators should be taken into consideration in terms of defining formality and informality? That's Jessica's question. My own question about COVID really speaks to the issue of inequity and impact of a biological hazard on existing socio-ecological vulnerability in the city. And so I wanted to pose that to both Marianne and Stephen, as well as to Paulo, in the sense of the problems that we're seeing today, given the kind of built environment that we've actually caused in Metro Manila.
If I may, I think the project post-COVID is a new build, and that is to address the primary problem of lack of affordable housing. And the new Department of Urban Development and Human Settlements has to realign their goals and not just talk to private developers as they're doing now, but engage all of the stakeholders in trying to address this 5 to 6 million backlog which has been there for the last 20 or 30 years. And if we are to be resilient and protect ourselves from future pandemics or disasters, housing is key, because the vectors of disease spread faster in the current conditions of high density informality that we have. And so that is what the next administration should prioritize if we are to move forward post this COVID-19.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I mean, the way I understand your answer and the way I sort of think about it is that the answer to both of those questions is really the same. In order for us to get to a point where a post-COVID city is a more equitable city, then we need to acknowledge the divisions, the artificial divisions, the economic and social divisions. And this is not just true for the Philippines. This is true in the United States. This is true in every country that has metropolitan areas in them. And to take this moment of COVID where we can see and we can measure with our eyes, but we certainly can measure with statistics that the most impacted communities are the urban poor. And those are people who have difference in, race, ethnicity, caste, or income. But they're always the urban poor. And they're the ones who are actually, we rely on. They're the service industry workforce. And so we're relying on them the most. We're paying them the least. They don't have insurance and they don't have a great outlook even coming into COVID beforehand. And so to me, the answer is to take this COVID situation as an opportunity to direct formal public and private resources directly to and into the communities that are being the most impacted by COVID. So, this is sort of like, income or impact criteria for national and local disaster grants, right? That are really targeting informal communities that have limited access to open space, that have limited access to housing tenure and housing stability, and really using that money, the COVID recovery money that builds infrastructure, that provides housing and business recovery, really targeting that within the urban poor communities, because that does the first level of breaking down the silo. You're taking formal financial and economic tools and applying them to an informal, deliberately centering them on informal contexts and informal communities. So, to me, and, that involves, there's also a longer term, I think, solution, which involves thinking about the impacts of development, the positive impacts of development in terms of increased tax base, increased property values, increased productivity, increased jobs, and making sure that value is captured in some way and directed and redistributed to those who need it the most. So I think there's an immediate term COVID response, which says take the formal financial tools that we have and focus them on the informal sector. And then the longer term is acknowledge the positive growth and impact that development has, but capture that value so that it can be distributed equitably.
Well, if I may, Stephen, on that point of the tax base and the problem with the 17 LGUs in Metro Manila and their reliance on their IRAs, and the fact that to release the pressure for them to hang on to development and just go for the lowest hanging fruit for private development without any provision for socialized housing or the loopholes that developers now take. A new type of metropolitan governance could more equitably distribute the taxes across the 17, but that would entail totally revamping the whole governance structure of Metro Manila into a provincial or regional governance, and making sure that there's more balanced distribution of incomes across the entire metropolis. Right now, you have different LGUs of different sizes, and you have the 450 hectares of the new Bilibid is really tantalizing for for developers, and the default would go to higher end gated communities to the detriment of social equity, and we have to think out of the box.
But isn't there a shorter term possible set of solutions? I mean, if you think about any large, very site specific new development, right? Why is it that you can't sort of draw a line around that, create a tax increment finance district of some sort, where you say, okay, whatever value this development produces, we're going to make sure that a portion of that is going to be directed to ensure that those that it is impacting negatively are actually impacted positively as well.
Well, that's where the comprehensive land use plan and the economic development plan of each of the LDUs have to come in sync, and such solutions can be had, but it has to go get to local legislation. But best practices would then point to all of the other LGUs understanding that this is what could work for all of the cities and the one town in Metro Manila. I think the connections between the mayors should be stronger, but that's difficult. Yes, there are initiatives that can be had for more site-specific solutions, but it is complex, and it is, as the name says, site-specific. So we would have, as you know, as physical planners, have to look at the site itself and generate the solutions based on that, and the communities that are in and outside of it to find something workable.
Thank you very much, Paulo, and Stephen, and Mayor Fresnedi, and Councilor Biazon. This is really exciting. I hope, Tony, we can have another conversation maybe 2 or 3 months from now, because these are really the things that I would think matter really. So I hope we can have this conversation sometime. And I wanted to call on Father Jet, but we're running out of time. And I also want to apologize to all. There are 15 big questions from the Q&A section, but we want to apologize that we're running out of time. We will have to really end this, and I would like to get the closing remarks of Ms. Antonia Yulo Loyzaga, the President of the National Resilience Council. But we would like to say that all of this will be recorded, and it will be in the CCAR-PH YouTube channel as well as the National Resilience Council channel. So I would like to ask those who are in the chat room really that you will have all your you'll have access to all those. Please subscribe and like our pages, and also in Facebook, because this will be all recorded there and posted there. Also, keep track of the other activities that the National Resilience Council and the CCAR-PH are doing. So we really thank you for your generosity of time and ideas. This is really great. I think we should have this kind of conversation about urban development and equity and sustainability and resilience. This is the kind of, I would say, conversations that should happen across. And I hope the National Resilience Council will not get tired of facilitating these conversations. That for me, it really matters. If you say Muntinlupa matters, these things matter. So can we now ask Tony to please give the closing remarks, and Mary Ann and Stephen, this is not the last. This is the beginning of other conversations together with Mayor Fresnedi, Congressman Biazon, Architect Alcazaren, and Father, academicians like Father Jet, and all the other stakeholders. Okay, thank you, Tony. Can you take the screen?
Yes,
please?
thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Ems. No, and before I go into this rather involved slide, I'd like to thank Stephen, Marianne, and Dito basically for making that studio possible. And our keynotes, the messages from Father Bobby and Ambassador Romulo for setting the context for this discussion. Our excellent reactors, Father Jet, Paulo, Congressman Ruffy, Mayor Fresnedi, your contributions today are invaluable. And again, this discourse really was made possible by so many hands, but we hope that the takeaways from the discussion today may be able to help us also support your work at Muntinlupa, and we'd be very happy to explore how we may move forward on some of these suggestions as they may become workable for you in Muntinlupa City between Doc Emma and myself, the National Resilience Council and CCAR-PH. We'd be very happy to continue to work with you on the participatory work, basically risk assessment, planning and budgeting if that's needed. We certainly would be there for you. I'd just like to maybe make a few points to wrap up today before looking at the slide. We learned from our resource persons, our technical experts here, both Stephen and Marianne, that access to resources are really what drives the settlement of peoples, and that's something that the work of Paulo and other and people like Dingy von Eisendel as well continue to remind us about. There are, because of these settlement drivers, there are disproportionate impacts, differentiated vulnerabilities and exposures that actually result from the way people settle and because of the need to access resources. The use of land and space basically can be transformative if we are able to address the kind of access to socioeconomic and environmental needs that really will result in the quality of life that will be more equitable for everyone. But these inequities, as we see them, actually have resulted in risk being created and in a disproportionate way among communities that are most vulnerable in the city, which are the urban poor. We're looking at several transects here, and the most important transects, I think, that have been mentioned are the rural-urban one, but also the Ridge-River-Reef transects. And it's again in the intersection between the physical and the social and ecological geographies that risk actually is generated. And so we need to keep that in mind as we participatorily become involved in the planning of our cities and the building out of our cities. Another key message was public-private partnership is very important, and the role of academe, CSOs, people's organizations and communities cannot be minimized. We are working towards a kind of evidence-informed transformation, and that's where academe, in fact, can play a very special role. Paulo had emphasized our historical perspectives and how these continue to dominate the way we build our cities today. And I think that among the key points that he made is that we are stuck in the framing of using political boundaries as against ecological and social boundaries that actually will be the context of the way, or should be the context of the way we make our decisions. So political administrative boundaries versus the socio-ecological, and again, those are those intersecting geographies that we continue to encounter in terms of risk generation. The importance of participatory planning and budgeting, I think, should not be underemphasized. And here is where perhaps some of the pathways towards equity can actually take root. And Mayor Fresnedi has said that the Muntinlupa City is very much open to doing this and are already doing it. And we hope to be able to assist in and support the process further. Bouncing forward together has a spatio-temporal dimension to it, and we need to be conscious of the way integration and coordination between national, regional, and local decision-making is happening in order for us to address specific needs on the ground. The NBP, the Bureau of the Department of Justice Property is one illustrative example of the need for a greater integration and coordination in terms of providing the kind of socioeconomic incentives to actually improve equity in the situation wherein private investment, commercial development actually is a main driver. Finally, I just wanted to say that we are talking about housing and social services and improving that within the city, but I think what we really need to consider, and Father Jet has raised this, are there alternatives to these cities that we actually are residing in today? And I recall one of Paulo's professors, Taekeng Sun, talking to us in 2003 and in the conference that Emma was also at, wherein he said we need to stop the migration into the cities and then accommodating migration and build new cities which actually have embedded in them the kind of social equity characteristics that we need to see to provide quality of life for everyone that will be drawn to these magnets. And I think that's where we need to actually continue to contemplate what is the future for urban development in the country. I end with this last slide because, in fact, we are working within the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction today. The National Resilience Council goes by this Bible. There's been a great transition from managing hazards to actually building resilience under the SFDRR. And the intersection between SFDR and the Sustainable Development Goals is where we find this discussion in terms of urban transformation and improving equity in order to achieve resilience. And you can read the slide and view it as you see it, but this is in fact the kind of foundational basis for our conversation with you today. And we hope that in fact that we have changed the discourse somewhat by allowing you to hear and making it possible for you to hear all the inputs and insights that you've had from all the speakers. We are happy to continue this conversation, and Doc Emma, I know we will. So thank you very much, one and all, for being part of our discussions today. We've had people from across the practice, different academic institutions are also present, as well as practitioners, and of course our local government partners, National Resilience Council partners. Thank you very much for being here today. And Stephen and Marianne, we hope this will not be the last of our conversations, and we'll continue to touch base with you as we move forward in terms of urban transformation for equitable resilience. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Thank you, Tony. I will take up on that, on continuing this conversation, because I think we started here really interrogating the ways that cities are being planned, the ways that communities are being developed from the hierarchical point of view and the like. So thank you very much, Tony. And now I'll give it to Ina to officially close this, but I'd like to thank everyone. I think the discussions have been very brilliant, thought-provoking, and allowed us to think about what to do, yeah? And also, it really inspires us what we should be working towards. So thank you very much. I'm very grateful. So Ina, yeah.
Thank you, Eric. I can't thank everyone enough for joining us today and for all your questions, via chat and engagement online. Before we officially close this live stream, we wish to invite everyone to our next webinar to formally welcome Women's Month 2021. So we invite you to on Monday, Gender, Climate, and Resilience, Challenges of Equity and Sustainability. You may register at the link on your screens. And will be happy to hear from you through our webinar evaluation form available at bit.ly/EER in Metro Manila -eval. So that's bit.ly/EER in eval. So thank you very much. Thank you,
and
everyone.
those who want certificate of attendance, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Have a good day. Have a good evening, all.